The contract said 1 year. It said no bond, no heirs, no love. It said temporary in every way that mattered. And nothing I had read 3 times by failing candlelight in my small room in Frostmere had prepared me for the cold weight those words would carry once I was standing inside the fortress they led me to. I had signed it anyway. My hands had trembled so badly the ink smeared beneath my fingers. Not from grief, not from second thoughts. From the particular kind of cold that settles into a person who has always understood her own smallness and cannot decide if that smallness is a mercy or a wound. 3 weeks later, I stood in the entrance hall of Blackstone Keep, the seat of the Alpha King's power, fortress carved from dark stone and older ambition, wearing a borrowed gown over a borrowed life, waiting for a man I had never met to decide whether I was useful enough to tolerate. The hall smelled of iron and old stone and something else beneath it all, something layered like smoke caught in fabric for years. Power, maybe, or grief. In places like this, the two had a way of becoming indistinguishable. Torches burned against the dark walls in iron brackets, their light restless and orange, throwing shadows across the stone floor that shifted like living things. Somewhere above me, cold air moved through the vaulted ceiling. I felt it against my collarbones, against the back of my neck, where the braid I had pinned that morning was already coming undone. I had a talent for that, coming undone in quiet ways no one ever noticed. You're only here to stabilize the trade routes, I reminded myself. 1 year, no attachment, no complications. When the spring thaw opens the eastern passes, you go home to Frostmere and return to the quiet life you were always designed for, the quiet life. I was 22 years old, an omega from a dying northern territory, the unremarkable niece of a lord who had run out of options and reached at last for me. My hair was the color of winter wheat and never stayed where I placed it. My eyes were the grey-green of lichen on cold rock. I was not the woman people wrote stories about. I was the woman people forgot was standing in the room. You won't complicate things, my Uncle Aldrich had said the morning he explained what I would be doing with my next year. He had folded his hands on his desk, the way men do when they have already decided, and simply want your silence to sound like agreement. You're sensible, steady, you won't fall apart in his court, and you certainly won't develop feelings for a man like Cale Draven. 1 year of political marriage. He needs the alliance to silence the Western Lords, and we need his protection through winter. That's all this is. That's all this is. I had repeated those words to myself every day since. Nothing about Blackstone Keep made them easier to believe. Nothing about the way the wolves here moved, coiled and deliberate, always measuring the distance between themselves and every person within reach, was simple. These were not the pack wolves I knew from Frostmere, who argued over grain tallies and dozed through council meetings. These men were weapons that had learned to wear stillness as a disguise. Every glance they offered me arrived a fraction too sharp, a fraction too long, like a blade testing for the soft place. I heard Cale Draven before I saw him, not his voice. He wasn't speaking, it was the room. A collective, involuntary recalibration, noble heads lifting fractionally, guards pulling their spines straight without being commanded to. Even the torches seemed to burn brighter against the stone for a breath, as if the light itself understood what it meant when he entered a space. I turned toward the staircase. He descended slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because a man like that had never needed to hurry toward anything in his life. Broad-shouldered and dark, enormous in a way that had nothing to do with size alone. Black fur crossed his shoulders over leather armor. His hair was braided back from a face that had been carved. I was certain in those first suspended seconds, specifically to make the rest of the world feel inadequate by comparison. The scar cut across his jaw like a sentence written in someone else's war. But it wasn't the scar that made my breath go still. It was his eyes, silver blue, cold as the eastern passes in deep winter, and fixed directly on me with the kind of attention I had spent my entire life studying how to avoid. He reached the foot of the stairs. The hall held itself at half-breath around him. I had prepared for indifference, for the particular boredom powerful men carried when something disposable was presented to them as though it were a gift. I had prepared to be looked through, to stand in the dead center of his gaze and still register as empty space. He looked at me instead, not with cruelty, not with assessment exactly, with something quieter and more unsettling, the expression of a man who had encountered an unexpected variable and was deciding, very carefully, what to do about it. The silence between us stretched until it had edges. "You're frightened," he said, low voice, certain, the way someone states a fact they have no interest in softening. My chest tightened painfully. "No," I said. One corner of his mouth moved, almost. "Good. He turned toward his captain without another word. "Show my wife her chambers, my wife." The words moved through me strangely, not like a title, like something structural shifting in a wall I had believed was solid. The chambers shocked me. I had expected cold luxury, the kind of ornate indifference that said you are kept, not considered. Heavy drapes and minimal fire, and a room designed to communicate status rather than comfort. What I found instead was warmth, candles already burning beside the bed, books arranged neatly on the shelves, histories, territorial maps, 2 volumes on northern medicinal plants I hadn't known I wanted until I saw them resting there as though someone had anticipated me. A kettle already steaming near the hearth. The furs were thick and soft and smelled of cedar, not politics. And then, the connecting door. Heavy dark wood, iron-bound, with a bolt fixed to my side, and when I leaned closer to confirm what I was seeing, a second bolt fitted to the other. "He ordered it installed yesterday," the captain said carefully, watching me study it. His words were that you should know you may lock it whenever you wish. He left me alone with that. I stood in the warm, borrowed room and stared at the bolt in silence, and felt something dangerous loosen in the careful structure I had spent years building around myself. Cruel men did not think about whether frightened women felt safe. I locked the door anyway, then lay in the dark with the fire burning low, listening to footsteps pace slowly and steadily on the other side of the wall, back and forth, patient and relentless, like a man who had long since made peace with the fact that sleep was not something that came to him anymore. I should have found it unsettling. Instead, for the first time since I had smeared my signature across that cold contract 3 weeks ago, I found I could finally breathe, which was, I would later understand, exactly where the danger began. Morning arrived at Blackstone, keep the way it arrived everywhere in deep winter, reluctantly and without warmth. I had slept in fragments, waking twice to the faint sound of movement behind the connecting door before the keep finally settled into the kind of silence that meant the hour before dawn. By the time pale grey light edged through the heavy drapes, the pacing had stopped. I lay still for a while, noticing the absence of it, and found the quiet more unsettling than the sound had been. A maid arrived with a basin, a gown, and very few words. I was grateful for all 3. The first royal council of my marriage began at the 9th hour. I had attended council sessions in Frostmere. Quiet affairs, mostly. My uncle's advisors speaking over one another about grain stores and border patrol rotations, while I sat at the back table recording figures no one would ever read carefully. The kind of rooms where a woman with a quill and downcast eyes became part of the furniture. Cale's council chamber was nothing like that. It was a long room of dark stone and high windows, cold light falling across a table that could have seated 30. Maps were spread along its surface, territorial, military, trade route overlays marked in different inks. Candles burned in iron fixtures overhead despite the morning light, because in a fortress this deep, daylight never quite reached the center of things. The wolves seated around that table looked up when I entered, not with welcome, with measurement. I had understood in Frostmere that powerful men ignored women they considered beneath notice. What I understood now, 3 steps inside that door, was that powerful men in Iron Hollow operated differently. They didn't ignore potential weaknesses. They catalogued them. Every eye in that room was taking inventory. I chose a seat near the middle of the table. Not the foot, which would announce submission, and not the head, which would announce ambition I hadn't earned. The middle was the only place invisible women could survive a room like this. I folded my hands on the surface and kept my expression carefully empty and waited. Cale arrived without ceremony. He simply appeared at the head of the table, seated himself, and the council began, as though the air had only been waiting for him to authorize it. He did not look at me, but I looked at him. In the cold morning light, the exhaustion was clearer than it had been the night before. Not weakness. Nothing about Cale Draven could be mistaken for weakness, but something worn into the architecture of him. The careful stillness of a man who had long since learned to function without rest. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with nights spent pacing stone floors rather than sleeping in warm beds. I pulled my attention back to the table. The Northern Lords were already watching me again. She introduced herself an hour into the session, which was long enough that I had nearly convinced myself the morning would pass without incident. Lady Selene Vere. She was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. Precisely, and with the implicit understanding that beauty was not the point. Dark hair, immaculate posture, a gown cut in deep burgundy that made every other woman in the room look like they had dressed in the dark. She sat 3 seats to Cale's left, and she wore her proximity to him like a credential. She had been watching me since I sat down. I had been pretending not to notice. The moment arrived during a discussion of the Frostmare trade agreement. Naturally, my uncle's territory, my reason for existing in this room at all. Celine set down her wine glass with the quiet precision of someone who had timed the gesture. "Before we finalize the northern terms," she said pleasantly, "perhaps Lady Alara could clarify the scope of her involvement in drafting them. For the record," she smiled in my direction, "we do want the council to understand exactly what she brings to the arrangement." The room shifted, not visibly. Nothing so obvious as leaning forward, but something adjusted behind every set of eyes at that table, an appetite sharpening, a trap being laid with silk and perfect manners. She let the pause breathe before she delivered it. "Tell us, did the king choose you personally?" There it is. I understood the architecture of it immediately. Answer yes, and every lord in that room would know I was lying. No one believed Kael Draven had personally selected a forgotten Omega from a dying border territory. Answer no, and I handed the entire council confirmation that I was exactly what they suspected. A signature, a convenience, a political footnote that could be ignored and eventually discarded. The room waited. I opened my mouth without knowing yet what would come out of it. I chose her because she notices what others miss. Kael's voice arrived without inflection, without warmth, and without any detectable interest in the effect it produced. He hadn't looked up from the territorial map in front of him. That makes her more valuable to this council than most of the people seated at it. Now he looked up, at Celine specifically. "Shall we continue?" The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Celine's smile remained precisely in place, which told me she was very good at this. But she said nothing further, and the session moved on, and the room recalibrated around the fact that Kael had just made his position clear without raising his voice even slightly. I kept my hands folded on the table and my face carefully composed and did not allow myself to look at him. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, I stood alone for a moment and let the cold stone wall do what warm rooms wouldn't. Hold the weight of the morning upright. He had not looked at me when he said it. That was the detail I kept returning to. He hadn't turned toward me, hadn't performed concern in front of witnesses, hadn't made a show of protection designed to be noticed and commended. He had simply closed the door on the trap before I could fall through it, and then gone straight back to the map, as though protecting me had required no more thought than breathing. That frightened me considerably more than the wolves at the table ever could. I found the archives on my third day. No one had sent me there. No one had suggested it, or offered to show me the way, or expressed any interest whatsoever in what I might do with my hours between the council sessions and the formal dinners I was apparently expected to perform at each evening, like a well-dressed piece of evidence that the Frostmere Alliance existed. I had simply followed the cold air and the smell of old paper down 2 flights of stairs and through a door that clearly hadn't been opened with any regularity, and arrived in a long vaulted room filled with the particular chaos of records that had been important once, and then, gradually, ignored. Territorial ledgers stacked without sequence. Trade correspondence filed by no system I could identify. Supply inventories from 3 winters back mixed with land surveys that predated Kael's rule entirely. Maps folded incorrectly, and therefore creased through their most critical borders. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I found a candle, pulled off my outer cloak, and went to work. Organizing things had always been how I thought. There was a particular calm in taking disorder and walking it slowly backward towards sense, in understanding that chaos was never random, only unlabeled, and that every misplaced record was simply a thing waiting for someone patient enough to find where it belonged. I had been at it for perhaps 2 hours on the first afternoon, when I became aware that I was not alone. I turned. Kael stood in the doorway, not entering, simply present, in the way he always seemed to be present, occupying a space completely without needing to move through it. He looked at the spread of ledgers across the table, at the reorganized shelves behind me, at the small pile of correspondence I had flagged as potentially requiring current attention, and said nothing for long enough that the silence acquired texture. "The steward stopped coming down here 2 years ago," he said finally. I noticed. I set down the ledger I was holding. The Eastern supply records from last winter are missing entirely. Either they were misfiled or they were never submitted. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "Which do you think?" "Misfiled," I said. "There are gaps in the sequence, not absences. Someone was working quickly and stopped caring about order. That's different from someone deliberately not reporting." He studied me for another moment. Then he left without another word. He was back the following afternoon. It became a pattern before I had fully registered it was becoming one. He never announced his arrivals, never offered explanation for why the Alpha King of Iron Hollow had developed an apparent habit of appearing in a basement archive room where his political convenience of a wife was reorganizing records. He would stand near the shelves or sit at the far end of the table and review whatever correspondence his captain had brought him, and the room would hold us both in a silence that was, against all reasonable expectation, not uncomfortable. Occasionally, he would ask me something, not personal questions, practical ones at first. My interpretation of an old border agreement, the logic behind a trade route modification someone had proposed 2 seasons ago. He asked them the way he did everything, directly, without softening the request into pleasantry, as though there was no version of the question that required decoration. I answered them the same way. It seemed only fair. On the 4th day, he asked why I had reorganized the territorial maps by river system rather than by lord. Because lords change, I said, without looking up from the ledger I was cross-referencing. Rivers don't. If you want to understand how the territory actually functions rather than how it's currently governed, the water tells you more than the names do. The silence that followed, that one lasted long enough that I finally looked up. He was watching me with the expression I had noticed twice before, the one that arrived when I had apparently said something he hadn't predicted. Thoughtful, precise, like a man quietly revising a calculation. "You're different from what I expected," he said. The words arrived without performance, which made them land harder than they might have otherwise. "What did you expect?" I asked. He considered that seriously, which I hadn't anticipated. "Compliance," he said finally, "and silence. I can still provide those," I offered, "if the alternative is inconvenient." One corner of his mouth moved. It was the second time I had seen almost happen on his face. I was beginning to suspect that almost was as close as Cale Draven allowed most things to come. "No," he said simply, and turned back to his correspondence. I noticed other things in those quiet archive afternoons, the shadows beneath his eyes that no amount of composed stillness could entirely conceal. The way he held his shoulders, braced, always, like a man standing in wind that hadn't stopped for years. The slight delay sometimes before he answered questions, not from uncertainty, but from something that looked, in unguarded moments, remarkably like exhaustion. He never mentioned it, I never asked, but I began to understand, in the wordless language of shared silences, that the pacing I heard each night was not restlessness. It was something older and heavier than that, a man who had taught himself to keep moving, because stopping meant the grief had somewhere to settle. That night I left the connecting door unlocked, not deliberately, or at least, that was what I told myself, while I lay in the warm dark listening to the familiar rhythm of footsteps begin their slow circuit on the other side of the wall. Back and forth, patient, relentless. "Rivers don't change," I had told him. "They tell you more than the names do." I fell asleep before the pacing stopped. For the first time since arriving at Blackstone Keep, the sound didn't make me want to lock things tighter. It made me feel, inexplicably and dangerously, like I was exactly where the geography had always intended me to be. I found her in the archives first. Not the woman herself, there was nothing so direct as that. Just the shape of her absence, pressed into the records like a watermark visible only when you held the paper at the right angle. A name in the territorial census that stopped appearing after the 5th year of Cale's rule. Requisition orders for a second set of private chambers that were never completed. A physician's supply ledger with a single entry from 7 years back, the ink heavier than the surrounding lines, as though the hand recording it had paused too long before writing it down. Mira Ashvane, deceased, no cause, no elaboration, just the cold economy of official record, which told me everything and nothing simultaneously. I asked the maid who brought my morning basin. She went very still in the particular way people do when they have an answer they would rather not give. "There are different stories," she said carefully, not meeting my eyes. "Some say she fell ill. Some say she didn't." A pause. "Some say the king couldn't save her. Others say he wasn't there to try. She left before I could ask anything further." The servant's version and the noble's version diverged at almost every point, which meant the truth was almost certainly somewhere neither of them had thought to look. What they agreed on was the shape of the before and after. Before Cale had been formidable but not sealed, a hard king but a present one, visible in his court, occasionally capable of something that functioned like warmth in the right circumstances. After, stone walls and iron laws and a silence that had settled over Blackstone Keep like a second winter, one that had never fully lifted. What no one said plainly, But what every version circled without landing on was the word enemies. Spoken too quickly, abandoned too soon. The conversational equivalent of a room with a door someone had decided, long ago, would remain locked. I thought about that for 3 days before I said anything. It was a Wednesday evening. I know, because the kitchen sent up rosemary bread on Wednesdays, and the smell of it had followed me down to the archive, where Cale had arrived, as had become his habit, without announcement. He was reading a military dispatch. I was cross-referencing the Eastern supply ledgers I had finally located, misfiled exactly where I had suspected, behind 2 years of land surveys in the wrong cabinet. The fire between us was burning low. I set down my quill. "What haunts you?" The question arrived before I had fully decided to ask it. Cale went completely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man composing his response, but the sudden, absolute stillness of something that has been struck without warning and has not yet determined the extent of the damage. The dispatch lowered slowly to the table. For a long moment he said nothing. The fire crackled once between us. Outside the narrow archive windows, wind moved against the stones of the keep with a sound like breathing. "You've been asking the servants," he said. "The servants gave me 7 different stories. None of them told me anything true." His jaw tightened fractionally, then released. Her name was Mira. His voice was even, deliberate. The voice of a man who had decided, somewhere in the architecture of himself, that the only way to carry certain things was with both hands and perfect posture. She was taken by men who could not reach me through direct means. They used her instead. A pause. They succeeded. I didn't speak. "Love makes people into targets," he continued, quieter now. I understood that afterward with a clarity I had not possessed before. Every person you allow close enough to matter becomes a door your enemies can walk through. I decided there would be no more doors. He said it without self-pity. That was almost the worst part. He had taken an open wound and built a philosophy around it, so the wound could keep bleeding without anyone noticing. "That wasn't your failure." Cale turned to look at me. The expression that crossed his face in that moment was not one I had seen before. Not the controlled neutrality, not the almost that never quite arrived. It was something rawer and less defended than any of that. Something that looked, briefly, like the expression of a man who has been carrying a verdict for so long he had stopped questioning whether it was just. "They targeted her to destroy you," I said. "That's not something love made possible. That's something cruelty chose to do. Those aren't the same thing." The fire shifted between us. Cale was quiet for so long I thought he had decided not to answer. Then he turned his face slightly away, toward the window and the dark beyond it, and I understood that what I was witnessing was not coldness. It was a man trying to contain something that had suddenly become difficult to contain. "No one has ever said that," he said, very quietly. "In 7 years. I didn't know what to do with that, with the weight of 7 years of silence sitting in the room between us. So I did nothing. I let it occupy the space it needed to occupy, and I didn't try to fill it with comfort that would only have made it smaller than it deserved to be." After that, the evenings changed. He began staying later in the archive. The conversations grew longer, moved through different territories, history, governance, the particular challenges of ruling a kingdom that had been built on fear and was now, uncertainly, attempting something more sustainable. He asked my opinions in the direct way that had become familiar. I gave them in the same currency. Once, he brought the rosemary bread down from the kitchen himself. He set it on the table between us without comment, as though this were something ordinary, and went back to his correspondence. I ate half of it and did not say anything either. That night, I walked to the connecting door and slid the bolt back with a deliberateness I didn't bother pretending was accidental. The pacing began a short time later. I lay in the firelight and listened to it, that steady, patient circuit on the other side of the wall, and thought about doors, and what it meant to choose to leave them open, not because you had stopped being afraid, but because some things mattered more than the fear did. Numbers didn't lie. People lied constantly and with great creativity, but numbers, when you knew how to read them, told you exactly what had happened and, more usefully, exactly what someone had wanted you not to notice. I had been reading Blackstone Keep's trade ledgers for 12 days. What I found there had kept me in the archive until the candles burned to stubs for the past 4 nights running. It had started small. A discrepancy in the Western Garrison's monthly supply requisitions. Not a large one, not the kind of gap that announced itself. Just a quiet, persistent drift between what the garrison reported consuming and what the supply records showed being delivered. A few cartloads of grain each month, mod quantities of iron stock, unremarkable in isolation. The kind of variance a tired steward would round away, without a second thought. But I was not a tired steward, and I did not round things away. I pulled every Western supply record from the past 14 months and laid them out in sequence, and the pattern emerged with the slow, patient clarity of something that had been there all along, waiting for someone to look directly at it. The resources weren't being consumed, they were being redirected, not all at once. Nothing so obvious as that. Small amounts, irregularly spaced. The deliberate irregularity of someone who understood that consistent theft was easier to detect than varied theft. Someone who had thought carefully about what a distracted administration would and would not notice. Someone with access to both the supply chain and the council records that authorized it. I sat with that knowledge for 2 days before I brought it to KL. He listened to everything without interruption, which I had learned was his way. Complete attention, no performance of it. Just the real thing directed at you, with an intensity that made lesser concerns feel ashamed of themselves. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Western Garrison reports to Lord Aldrich Vane," he said. "He's held that posting for 9 years. His family has served Iron Hollow for 3 generations. "I know," I said. "You're suggesting someone is using his supply chain to move military resources without authorization. I'm suggesting the records show that's what's happening. I don't yet know who is authorizing it on the other end." Cale looked at the ledgers I had laid across the archive table, then at me. "My council has managed Iron Hollow's logistics for years without discrepancy." The words were not dismissive. He was not a man who dismissed things carelessly, but they carried the particular weight of deep trust, the kind that has been built over a long time and does not release its grip easily or without cause. "I know that too," I said evenly. "I'm not asking you to act on it. I'm asking you to let me keep looking." Another silence. Then "keep looking." The winter banquet was Lord Harren Voss's occasion. Harren Voss was a Northern Territorial lord of the old school, loud, well-fed, and possessed of the absolute confidence of a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where no one contradicted him. He had arrived at Blackstone Keep 3 days prior for what was diplomatically described as a courtesy visit, and was, by every observable measure, an attempt to test the strength of KL's current alliances and find the weakest point. He had decided, within approximately 4 hours of my introduction, that I was it. I had been expecting something like this. Men like Harren Voss always looked for the soft target first. He began at the banquet table, during the second course, with the comfortable cruelty of a man who believed he was simply making conversation. "Frostmere," he said expansively, addressing the table at large rather than me specifically, which was its own kind of technique. "Struggling territory, poor yield last 2 winters. What's left of the trading routes barely worth the maintenance. A pause designed to feel like generosity. Still, I suppose some alliances are made for reasons other than strategic value. Symbolic ones, perhaps." He left the implication exactly where he intended to leave it, floating above the table like smoke, too diffuse to directly challenge, pointed enough that everyone understood what it meant. Several nobles found the middle distance suddenly fascinating. I set down my wineglass. "Frostmere's eastern pass controls access to 7 northern supply routes that Iron Hollow depends on through winter," I said pleasantly. "3 of which, I notice, run through territory that borders your own, my lord. Which means any degradation of the Frostmere alliance directly affects your import costs come spring thaw." I let that settle for exactly 1 breath. "I imagine that's why you've been petitioning the council for revised transit fees for the past 2 years. The records from those sessions make for interesting reading." The table went very still. Harren Voss's expression moved through several configurations before settling on something he was trying to make look like amusement. "You've been reviewing council petition records," he said. "I've been reviewing everything," I said simply, and returned to my wine. The conversation moved on. It always does. But the quality of the silence that preceded it told me what I needed to know about how the room had recalibrated. Cale said nothing to me about it that evening, but I felt his attention shift during the exchange the way you feel a change in the direction of the wind. Not dramatically, just a slight and unmistakable reorientation. And twice in the hours that followed, when I was engaged in conversation with other guests, I caught the particular quality of his gaze from across the room. Not monitoring, not assessing. Something quieter than either of those things. Lord Varick walked me to the corridor afterward under the pretense of courtesy, which told me his pretenses were somewhat less sophisticated than Lady Celine's. He was pleasant and attentive and asked me 3 careful questions about how far my archival work had progressed. I answered all three with cheerful vagueness, and watched his eyes perform the rapid, controlled recalculation of a man who has just realized that the quiet woman in the corner has been reading the exact documents he needed her never to find. I returned to my chambers and wrote down everything I remembered about his questions. Then I went back to the ledgers. The proof arrived as the most dangerous things do, hidden inside something ordinary. I had been working backward through the redirected supply records, tracing the authorization signatures rather than the quantities, when I found the notation. A single line in a secondary ledger most stewards would never cross-reference. A routing authorization for military iron stock, signed not by the Western Garrison commander but by a council member acting under emergency procurement authority. Lord Varick's seal. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled the emergency procurement records for the past 18 months and found his seal 7 more times, each entry small enough to escape notice on its own. Each one routing resources not to any Iron Hollow garrison, but to a series of holding locations along the northern border. Locations that sat, I confirmed against the territorial maps, in direct proximity to the rival territories that had been quietly testing Iron Hollow's western boundaries for the past 2 years. Someone had been supplying Iron Hollow's enemies from inside Iron Hollow's own treasury. I kept pulling records. What I found next turned the cold in the archive from the weather into something else entirely. Buried in a communications ledger from 7 years prior, during the period of Mir Ashvane's death, was a series of coded supply authorizations I had initially set aside as routine. They weren't routine. When I laid them against the military movement records from that same period, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had provided Kael's enemies with detailed information about Mira's movements, her schedule, her security arrangements, the route she traveled to visit her family territory. The authorization signatures on those communications were in a different hand than Varick's current seal. Older, a junior council position from that era, a position Lord Varick had held before his elevation. I sat very still in the archive for a considerable amount of time. Then I went to find Kael. He read everything I placed before him without speaking. I watched his face perform the controlled stillness he brought to difficult information. That careful absence of expression that was, I had learned, not indifference but its opposite. The absolute concentration of a man containing something large enough to require all available structure. He reached the communications ledger last. The stillness changed quality. It became the stillness of something that has taken a significant impact and has not yet assessed the full extent of the damage. He was 23, Kael said, very quietly. When Mira died, he sat with me for 3 nights. He told me we would find who was responsible. A pause that had weight in it. I believed him. There was nothing I could say to that which would make it smaller or larger than it was, so I said nothing. Kael stood and moved to the window. Outside, the first preparations for the winter solstice were visible in the courtyard below. Servants stringing iron lanterns along the keep's outer walls, the faint smell of pine resin rising even to this height. The celebration was 2 days away. The entire court would be present. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady against the window frame. 7 years, he said. He has sat in my council for 7 years. Kael. He turned at the sound of his name. I had not used it before without the formality of title, and the directness of it seemed to reach him somewhere beneath the controlled exterior. He built this over years, I said, slowly, carefully. The same way the supply redirections were built, incrementally, counting on trust to do the work that concealment couldn't. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's a deliberate exploitation of it. You sound very certain of the distinction. I am certain of it. He looked at me across the room. The firelight was low, and the archive was very quiet, and the distance between us was not very large. I watched something move through his expression, grief and anger, and something raw underneath both of those things. The look of a man whose architecture of self-protection has just been shown to have a significant flaw in the original construction. He crossed the room, not quickly. The way he moved through most things, deliberately, with the full weight of his attention preceding him. He stopped close enough that I could see the fine lines exhaustion had made at the corners of his eyes, the slight irregularity of his breathing that told me he was less composed than he was presenting himself to be. His hand came up slowly. His fingers brushed the side of my face, barely the barest contact, the kind of touch that is still deciding what it is. I didn't move. For a moment, the archive held us both in the particular suspension of something that is about to change irrevocably and hasn't quite yet, and both people present are aware of exactly what is happening, and neither has decided yet whether to allow it. Then he stopped. He lowered his hand, stepped back with the careful deliberateness of a man physically removing himself from something he does not trust himself with. I can't, very quietly, not to me exactly, to the room, to whatever inhabited the space between what he felt and what he understood about the cost of feeling it. I know, I said. He looked at me, and what I saw in his face in that moment was not rejection. It was fear, the specific fear of a man who has learned in the most devastating way possible what happens to the things he lets himself love. I understood that fear. I was beginning to share it. The winter solstice began the following evening. Iron lanterns lit the walls of Blackstone Keep in amber rose. The great hall was transformed. Pine boughs draped across the stone, long tables set with candles. The entire court gathered in their formal colors. Music moved through the corridors for the first time since my arrival, and the keep breathed differently with it, like a creature momentarily forgetting its own nature. I stood at the edge of the celebration in a gown the color of winter ice, and watched Lord Varick move through the room, smiling, greeting. The trusted council wolf in his natural territory, utterly unaware that the quiet Omega he had dismissed as disposable leverage had spent 2 weeks reading every record that would eventually end him. Somewhere across the hall, Cale caught my eye. He held it for exactly 1 moment. Then he looked away. The lanterns burned on, and the danger that neither of us yet fully understood moved quietly through the celebration, wearing the face of a man we were not supposed to have found. I saw it in Varick's hands first, not a weapon. He was too careful for that, too practiced in the art of patience and concealment. It was a signal, a small, deliberate gesture across the great hall toward a man standing near the eastern entrance who had no business being at a solstice celebration, dressed as a keep servant when his bearing belonged to a soldier. I had spent enough time reading people through records to recognize the moment when the paper version and the human version aligned. I turned immediately toward Cale's position at the head table. I was not fast enough. The eastern doors opened first, then the northern ones. The sound that followed was not the sound of a celebration absorbing disruption. It was the sound of a room understanding all at once that it had been breached, screaming where there had been music, stone tables overturning, candles scattering across the floor in cascades of rolling light and sudden shadow. 6 men in dark traveling clothes moved through the northern entrance with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this specific room. I understood in the fraction of a second available, for understanding that they were not here for Cale. They were looking directly at me. The first one reached me before the guards did. His hand closed on my arm with the grip of someone who had been instructed to deliver, not destroy, which told me that Varick intended to use me the way Cale's enemies had once used Mira. Not a death, a leverage point, a door walked through. I drove my elbow into his throat with every piece of force I had, which was not very much, but was apparently sufficient to surprise him, because his grip released for exactly the half second I needed to move sideways behind an overturned table. It was not a long reprieve. The second man was already across the hall. Then Cale was there. I had seen him still, and I had seen him controlled, and I had seen the careful, contained power of a man who wore authority like a second skin. I had not seen him like this. He came through the chaos like something the darkness had produced specifically for this purpose. Half-shifted. Not fully, but enough that his eyes had gone the cold silver white of deep winter, and his movements carried the liquid, terrible efficiency of a predator that has stopped making calculations about restraint. The fur at his shoulders seemed to thicken. His hands, when they reached the man advancing toward me, did not hesitate. The fight was not long. It was brutal in the way that things are brutal when one party is operating entirely beyond the threshold of controlled response. Savage and absolute and deeply personal, in a way that had nothing to do with politics or treaties, or the tactical value of an Omega from a minor territory. Cale killed 3 men. I watched him do it. I watched the rage in his face, and underneath the rage, something that was not rage at all. Something closer to terror, the specific terror of a person confronting the exact scenario they had spent years constructing elaborate defenses against. Lord Varick attempted to reach the western exit during the fighting. Cale's captain intercepted him before he cleared the door. The sound Varick made when he was taken to the ground was not the sound of a man who had been surprised. It was the sound of a man who had known this was a possible ending and had decided the gamble was worth it anyway. He was wrong. Cale crossed the hall to me through the wreckage of the celebration. Overturned tables, scattered candles, the iron lanterns still burning absurdly along the walls as though nothing had changed, and his hands found my face with a shaking thoroughness that was checking, I understood for damage. His breathing was uneven, uncontrolled. The silver was fading slowly from his eyes. "You're not hurt," he said. It came out somewhere between a question and a command, as though he were instructing the universe to confirm it. "I'm not hurt." He looked at me for one more moment with that expression I had no category for. Too large for the architecture of his face, pressing against the careful structure of him from the inside. Then he took my hand and walked out of the great hall. The doors to his private chambers closed behind us, with the weight of everything that had been accumulating since a frightened Omega from a dying territory had stood in an entrance hall 3 weeks ago and told an Alpha King she wasn't frightened. No council, no performance. The fire was burning in his hearth, and the room was warm, and the sounds of the keep reorganizing itself around the aftermath of violence were distant here, muffled by stone and distance, and the specific quality of a space that had been deliberately sealed against the outside world. Cale stood with his back to me for a moment, his hands braced against the mantel, his breathing still working to find its level. "You almost died," he said. The hoarseness in his voice was not something he was managing successfully. "So did you. That's different." "It isn't," he turned. The firelight crossed the scar at his jaw. His eyes, fully his own again, the cold silver blue I had catalogued from the very first moment, held the particular expression of a man who has reached the end of the distance he is capable of maintaining and knows it. "I told myself this marriage was temporary," he said. "I told myself the contract made it safe, that nothing real was at risk because none of it was real." My chest had become very tight. "I told myself you were protected because I hadn't let myself." He stopped, tried again. "Because I had been careful. Cale, she died because I loved her." The words arrived raw and direct, stripped of the careful structure he usually built around them. "That's what I believed. For 7 years, that was the truth I operated from. And now?" I asked. He crossed the room. The way he moved toward me in that moment was unlike every other way I had seen him move. Not the deliberate, controlled approach of a man managing his own force, but something less defended than that. Something that had stopped calculating. He cupped my face in both hands. His palms were warm, still slightly unsteady. "There is nothing fake about what I feel for you anymore," he said. "There hasn't been for a long time." I had prepared responses for most things. I had not prepared for honesty that arrived with that particular quality, quiet and devastated and entirely certain, all at once. "I know," I said. "I stopped pretending otherwise weeks ago." Something in his face broke open in the way that things break when the structure holding them was always more fragile than it appeared. When he kissed me, it was not the kiss of a political arrangement reaching its logical conclusion. It was the kiss of two people who had been circling something real and necessary for a long time, and had finally, at the cost of considerable damage to everything around them, arrived. We did not speak much after. The fire burned lower. The sounds of the keep continued distantly beyond the heavy doors. At some point, I understood that neither of us was going to move toward the connecting door and the separate rooms that waited on the other side of it. Cale sat in the chair nearest the hearth. I sat on the low bench beside it. Our shoulders were close enough to touch. We let them. Outside the windows of Blackstone Keep, snow had begun falling on the winter solstice, soft and indifferent and utterly unconcerned with what had broken and what had begun inside the warm room where an Alpha King finally fell asleep in the presence of another person for the first time in 7 years. I stayed awake a little longer, listening to his breathing even out. It was the most important sound I had ever heard. I woke before he did. That fact alone felt significant, that Cale Draven, the Alpha King, who had not slept through a single night since a grief I had only recently been permitted to understand had taken up permanent residence in him, was still asleep in the grey morning light while I sat watching the hearth reduce itself to embers. He had not moved to his bed. He was still in the chair where exhaustion had finally, irrevocably, collected its debt. His head had fallen slightly to one side. The hard architecture of his face, so precisely maintained in every waking hour, had released itself into something that looked, not younger exactly, but less armored. Less carved, like the man underneath the king, visible at last because no one had remembered to put him away before sleep arrived. I stayed very still and did not make a sound. Some things deserved to simply be what they were, without being observed into self-consciousness. Lord Varick was formally arrested at the 7th hour. I was not present for it, but I heard the account from Cale's captain afterward, a man of few words who had apparently decided, sometime in the past weeks, that I was worth addressing directly. Varick had been held in the lower garrison since the solstice, and when the council seals were affixed to the charges that morning, He had said very little. The captain described his expression as the expression of a man who had known this accounting was eventually coming and had simply been hoping for more time. He had run out of it. The court, deprived of its most practiced architect of quiet manipulation, was visibly destabilized by midday. Alliances that had been arranged around Varric's influence required urgent reassessment. Lords who had been comfortably certain of their positions found themselves uncertain. The careful power structures that had calcified over years of his management cracked along fault lines that had always been there, invisible beneath the surface, waiting for the supporting structure to be removed. Into that destabilization, Cale moved with a clarity that told me he had been awake some time before I noticed it, and had spent those hours deciding exactly what needed to happen next. He appeared in council not as a man absorbing a crisis, but as a man who had already resolved one and was now managing the aftermath. He addressed Varric's betrayal directly, completely, and without the softening that courts usually preferred when their own failures were being discussed. He named what had happened. He named the consequences. He named the structural changes that would follow. And twice during that council session, when questions arose about the evidence trail that had exposed the conspiracy, he said simply, "My wife identified it, not the records indicated or it came to light through administrative review. My wife." The first time he said it, I watched 6 faces recalibrate simultaneously. The rumors reached the outer territories within 3 days. Servants talk, and servants' families live beyond the keep's walls, and information moves through the networks of ordinary people with considerably more efficiency than official dispatches. By the end of the week, the shape of the story had traveled as far as the northern border, that the Alpha King's Omega bride had quietly dismantled a years-long conspiracy from inside Spy Blackstone Keep's own archives, and that the Alpha King had publicly credited her for it. Lady Selene said nothing to me directly, but she looked at me across the council chamber on the 4th morning with an expression I had not previously received from her. Not warmth, not exactly, but a kind of reassessment. The specific look of a highly intelligent woman updating her understanding of a situation she had previously misread. I accepted it without comment. Some victories were quieter than others. That did not make them less complete. The evenings changed again, the way they had changed after the archive conversation about Mira, the way everything between us seemed to shift in increments rather than all at once, which I was beginning to understand was simply the nature of 2 people who had both learned that rapid change was a precursor to damage. We ate dinner together in his private sitting room on the 5th night. Not the formal dining hall, not a political performance. Just the small room adjacent to his chambers, a fire, 2 plates the kitchen had sent up, and a conversation that ranged across territorial governance and archival methodology, and the specific challenge of maintaining accurate census records in border regions with mobile populations. At some point, I noticed we had been talking for 3 hours. At some point after that, Cale looked at the fire rather than me and said, with the careful tone of a man who has decided to say something true and is navigating the distance between the decision and the execution, "When I came back to this keep after Mira died, I made myself a specific promise. I waited, that I would administer this territory well, that I would maintain its safety, that I would not allow it or the people in it to suffer for my failures." A pause. I kept that promise. But somewhere in keeping it, the keep itself became, he stopped, searched for the word with unusual deliberateness, airless, like a room where the windows have been sealed against the cold for so long you stop noticing the air has changed. The fire moved between us. "You stopped this place from becoming a tomb," he said. "I don't know if you understand that." I looked at him for a long moment. 22 years of being the woman in the corner of every room, the quiet niece. The unremarkable Omega who survived by remaining small enough not to register as anything worth addressing. I had believed for so long that the belief had become structural, that invisible women were simply what I was, not a circumstance but a category. "I think," I said carefully, "that I am beginning to understand several things I didn't when I arrived." Cale turned to look at me. "You are not what they sent you as," he said. It was not a compliment, exactly. It was a correction. The specific correction of a man adjusting the record to reflect what is actually true. "You were never that." Something settled in me that I hadn't realized had been waiting to settle for a very long time. He slept again that night. Properly, this time. In his bed, in his chambers, in the quiet that had replaced the relentless pacing that had kept both of us company through the wall for weeks. I heard the difference from my side of the connecting door, which was standing open, as it had been standing open since the night I had stopped pretending the choice was accidental. Silence where there had always been footsteps. I lay in the dark and listened to it, and understood that some absences were not losses. He came to find me in the archive the following morning. I was cross-referencing the final gaps in the Varick documentation when he appeared in the doorway. He looked, for the first time since I had arrived at Blackstone Keep, like a man who had slept. It changed him in ways that were small and enormous simultaneously. "I want to petition the council," he said, without preamble, "to dissolve the original contract terms." I set down my quill. "And replace them with what?" I asked. He crossed the room to where I was standing. He stopped close enough that I could see the silver in his eyes clearly. Warmer now, somehow, than it had seemed in those first cold moments on the staircase. "Something permanent," he said, "if you're willing." I considered him. The kept and the keeping. The walls that had come down not because either of us had dismantled them deliberately, but because something real had grown quietly in the space between two people who had both stopped believing that was still possible for them. "Ask me properly," I said. One corner of his mouth moved. This time it completed itself. "Stay," Cale said, "for the treaty, not for Frostmere. For this." Outside the archive window, snow was still falling on Blackstone Keep, patient and indifferent as it had always been. "Yes," I said. It was the easiest thing I had ever signed. The council chamber looked the same as it had on the morning of my first session. Same dark stone, same cold light through the high windows, same iron fixtures and territorial maps spread across the long table, same chairs arranged with the particular rigidity of rooms that understand themselves to be places where things are formally decided. I was not the same woman who had walked into it the first time. I understood that clearly, standing in the corridor outside the doors, while Cale's captain waited with the composure of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything that happened in this keep. I understood it the way you understand things that have changed gradually, not in a single moment but across many small ones, accumulated quietly until the total weight of them becomes undeniable. The woman who had arrived at Blackstone Keep 3 months ago had carried invisibility like a survival strategy, had measured her words by how little space they occupied, had believed, with the deep structural certainty of something learned very young, that the safest version of herself was the smallest one. I straightened the front of my gown, deep winter blue, Blackstone's color, chosen deliberately, and walked through the doors. The opposition announced itself through posture before anyone spoke. 3 northern lords seated together on the left side of the table, their silence carrying the specific quality of men who have coordinated their resistance in advance and are waiting for the appropriate moment to deploy it. Lord Fenwick, eldest of Cale's territorial council, whose objection to most things was less philosophical than habitual. 2 representatives from the Western Alliance whose investment in the original Frostmere contract terms was financial as much as political. They looked at me the way people look at complications they had hoped would resolve themselves without requiring direct confrontation. I took my seat and folded my hands on the table and looked back at them with the calm patience of a woman who had spent 3 months reading every document in their territory's administrative history. Lady Selene sat across from me. She was watching me with the careful attention she brought to everything, precise, measuring, the look of a mind perpetually in assessment. When our eyes met, she did not look away. Instead, she gave me a single fractional nod, the specific acknowledgement of one intelligent person to another, stripped of warmth but not of respect. It was from Selene Vere, the equivalent of an embrace. Cale entered without ceremony as he always did. The room recalibrated around him, as it always did. He moved to the head of the table, stood rather than sat, and addressed the council in the direct, undecorated way I had come to understand was not brusqueness but honesty. The communication style of a man who had decided long ago that clarity was more respectful than performance. The original marriage contract between Iron Hollow and Frostmere territory designated a term of 1 year, no bond, and a return to prior arrangement upon completion. He paused. "I am formally petitioning this council to dissolve those terms in their entirety." Lord Fenwick cleared his throat. "The alliance stability implications are improved, not diminished," Cale said. "The Frostmere trade routes were secured through the original agreement. What happened in this keep over the past 3 months secured considerably more than that." He did not look at me as he said it, but the room did. The conspiracy that nearly destabilized Iron Hollow's eastern alliances was identified and dismantled from within the administration by my wife, without instruction, without recognition, and at personal risk. The chamber was very quiet. I am not petitioning to extend a political contract, Cale said. I am petitioning to dissolve one. What I am proposing in its place is not an arrangement. He turned to look at me then. In front of his entire council, in the cold morning light of the chamber where I had once sat braced for the public humiliation of being identified as a political convenience and nothing more, Cale Draven looked at me with the full, unguarded weight of everything he felt, and did not manage any of it. Ilara Vile came to this keep as a signature on a treaty, he said. She remained as something this territory, and I needed far more than another alliance. She is not political convenience. She is not a temporary arrangement. A pause, brief and absolute. She is my chosen queen, and I love her. This council should understand that those facts are now the permanent foundation from which every other decision will be made. The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence I had experienced in that room before. Lord Fenwick opened his mouth. Lady Selene spoke first. I will second the petition, she said clearly. Her voice carried the complete authority of a woman who understood that rooms like this moved on confidence before they moved on consensus. She looked at Fenwick with the pleasant implacability of someone who has made a decision and is now simply waiting for the room to catch up. Lady Alara dismantled a conspiracy that would have destabilized every alliance at this table, including yours, my lord. I watched her do it. I watched her do it quietly, without credit and without complaint. A pause. Iron Hollow has had queens with more power and fewer qualities worth admiring. I suggest we proceed. The vote was not unanimous. It did not need to be. The bonding ceremony was held that evening, in the small courtyard off Cale's private wing rather than the Great Hall. Not because it was secret, because some things did not require an audience to be real. The court had been informed. The territories would receive their dispatches by morning. The record would be made in the official ledger in my own handwriting, which felt somehow entirely appropriate. What mattered was not the witness count. What mattered was the moment Cale stood before me in the torchlight, with the winter air moving between the stone walls around us, and took both my hands in his with the careful steadiness of a man who has stopped being afraid of what he is holding. The words of the bonding were old ones, older than the political structures built around them, older than the contracts and the alliances and the cold ink of temporary arrangements. Words for two people choosing each other, past the point where choice can be taken back. When the ceremony reached its completion, Cale pressed his forehead to mine and stayed there for a moment in the particular silence of something that has been a long time arriving, and has finally, irrevocably arrived. I spent 7 years, he said quietly, making sure I would never have to feel this again. I know, I said. I was wrong. I know that too. He pulled back enough to look at me. The torchlight crossed the scar at his jaw. His eyes were the silver blue I had catalogued from the very first moment on the staircase, warmer now than they had ever been, the cold in them replaced with something I recognized because I had watched it arrive, gradually, over 3 months of archive afternoons and unlocked doors, and rosemary bread set quietly between us without comment. He kissed me the way the second kiss is always different from the first, less desperate, more certain. The kiss of a man who has stopped calculating the cost and simply arrived. Snow fell outside Blackstone Keep that night. Soft and patient, the way it always fell in deep winter. Indifferent to politics, indifferent to contracts, indifferent to the careful arrangements powerful people made to protect themselves from the things they most needed. I stood at the window of my chambers for a while and watched it settle on the stones of the courtyard below. Then I turned back toward the room. The connecting door between our chambers stood open. No bolt shot across on my side, no lock engaged on his. Just the open threshold between two rooms that had never, in the end, been as separate as the architecture implied. I looked at it for a moment. Then I walked through it and did not look back. The contract had said 1 year. It had said temporary in every way that mattered, written in cold ink by people who believed that some things could be contained by the right language if the language was precise enough. They had been wrong about that. They had been wrong about me. And Cale Draven, the Alpha King, the Wolf of Blackstone, the man whose enemies had once believed grief had made him permanently unreachable, was asleep in the warm room on the other side of that open door, breathing evenly, not pacing, not carrying the night alone. No locks, no barriers, no performance of smallness, no careful management of how much space I was permitted to occupy. Nothing fake anymore, only this, only us. Only the snow falling quietly outside the windows of Blackstone Keep, indifferent and eternal, while inside its walls, 2 broken people had finished the long and necessary work of choosing to stop surviving alone. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.